Hi, I'm Caroline Stocks with Poultry Health Today, and with me is Professor Oscar Fletcher from North Carolina State University. Now, Professor Fletcher, over the past 50 years you've had a pretty impressive career. 2 decades at the University of Georgia, then 15 years away from academia, and then another 15 years at North Carolina State. Why did you leave teaching and what brought you back?
I went from the University of Georgia to be the dean at Iowa State University, and I was dean there for about 3 years. And then I left that job to become dean at North Carolina State University. And so I had that job for 12 years.
Now, you gave one of the keynote speeches at this year's American Association of Avian Pathologists meeting, and in it you compared the differences between your first 15 years in academia and the second period of academia, so to speak. Now, you might expect that over that period there are a lot of differences, but you actually talked about a lot of the similarities.
It's a unique perspective when you've worked for 21 years and then you've got a break, and a substantial break in time, and you come back and you kind of wonder, well, what's different and what's the same? And so right away the thing I knew was that avian tissue responds to injury in certain ways, and that hasn't changed. The other thing is that in fact, most of the diseases that I saw in my then period, if you will, I still saw in the now period. So the diseases themselves hadn't changed. Now, sometimes the responses of the bird to the agent changed, but in some cases there were really new diseases. Wooden breast is an example of one. Real viral tenosynovitis is an example where the agent was the same, the bird maybe modified a little bit, maybe the viral agent modified to some extent, but what the clinical presentation and the histopathology of that was very different in the now period than it was in the then period. But the fundamentals that I was involved in teaching avian pathology to students was those basic responses are still constant, so I didn't have to change or modify that. So I could still focus on helping students learn to recognize what are those changes, how do you inventory them, and what's in the tissue that's not bird particularly. If it is bird and it's abnormal, then why is it abnormal? Is it in the wrong place? Is it too much of it? But in most cases, we're looking for things that are not bird. Generally, I'm referring to things like bacteria, fungi, protozoa, other parasites, viral inclusion bodies, fungi, things that are clearly not bird and in many cases diagnostic. And so my basic approach to teaching was to simplify it, to make it less focused on recognizing specific diseases up front and get focused on how do you recognize what's the bird telling you, what's the response to injury. And once you can do that, then you can begin to figure out what might be causing those responses. So that's my perspective on what was then and what was now.
Infectious bursal disease was another one that you identified as a key disease. How has that changed?
Well, in infectious bursal disease, there are different variants of the virus, if you will. And in some cases different now than they were then. Even though it's bursal disease, it's modified somewhat. The complication about the then period was we didn't know about chicken infectious anemia during much of that time. And I don't know what the impact of chicken infectious anemia was on changing or modifying the lesions that we thought were due to infectious bursal disease. Because I think my impression is that we had more hemorrhages associated with infectious bursal disease then than we do now. But the underlying impact of infectious bursal disease is to cause immunosuppression because it kills cells in the bursa fabricius. And so we don't have bursa-dependent lymphocytes that are capable of making antibody. And so it's still a significant immunosuppressive disease. And we still, I mean, the classic lesions of necrosis beginning in a few follicles and spreading through the rest of the bursa is still a feature of the disease today. So that's a way in which the avian tissue has continued to respond to injury in the same way.
Now, there's been some major advances in technology over recent years, which have really helped with tracking disease. How do you think that data has really revolutionised the poultry industry?
We have much better tools now to handle large amounts of data and to preserve it in ways that we didn't have in the early period of my career. There's tools available to manage massive amounts of data, and companies are getting better and better. In fact, they've used it for quite a while to manage, production parameters and a variety of things down to a few fractions of a cent even. And I think we're catching up to that a little bit in disease and in our diagnostic efforts. A lot of the tools now are connected directly to databases, and the information flows seamlessly without having to be double entered. The concept of using a test, and you could collect that data very easily, and then you can generate graphs and data. You can generate visual information that you can use to convince your CEO, if you will, or your flock manager or whoever you're working for. Here's the importance of using this vaccine, because we can do some controlled experiments and trials and work those things out.
Is there anything over that time that you've been disappointed to see that either hasn't been achieved or is still going on?
Well, I had it was a bit of a surprise to me that it was so easy to come back after that 15-year gap, because the diseases I was familiar with in the then period were still the diseases that we were dealing with in the now period. So in some cases we've been able to control them, like Marek's, for example. We were able to control the production of tumors or development of tumors, but not the infection and shedding of the virus. And so the virus, we believe, is having a significant negative immunosuppressive effect in birds, but that's not as readily visible to us as a tumor. And so we need to focus on, well, we haven't solved that problem yet. If you look at something like coccidiosis is still a major problem. It was a problem then, it's a problem now. I mean, those little critters know how to adapt to whatever we're doing. So we haven't made much of an impact there. And one surprise relative to protozoal parasites is histomoniasis. Because in the then period, I would have told you that I would expect to see that in turkeys, but I would not expect to see it in broiler breeders. But now, of the cases I see far more in broiler breeders than I get from turkeys. And so that's a disease which has been around a long time, but we still don't have effective means to control or manage it. So that's a disappointment. This is not as much a disappointment as a concern, and the concern is it's just a question. I don't know that we have enough data to answer the question, but the question is do we have enough scientific person power to deal with the issues that the poultry industry faces? I would make an argument that we don't. And even though I'm in a place that's engaged in producing some of those people, and I think we have an effective program to do that, but I still have concerns that we don't have as many scientists working worldwide to solve some of these problems as we used to. And histomoniasis would be a good example of that, because there's not as many people working on the parasites of poultry as there were when I was in my then period.
So how do we overcome that? How do we get more people coming back to the industry?
Well, good question. I don't know. I know some things that we're doing, and what we're doing in our institution is looking at attracting students that have been pre-veterinary students at an undergraduate level and have done that work in poultry science. So they already come to us with an interest in poultry. And we're working hard to keep them interested in that. We have a poultry club, for instance, for students with about 30, 35 students in it. We'll never have 35 graduates out of a class of 100 go into poultry, but generally every year we'll have 1 or 2. And so we have to keep doing that. And the opportunities are out there, so we just have to make students aware of that. I mean, here's a good place for you to be that you might not have thought about, even though you might have been in poultry science as an undergraduate. You might have done that just because you thought that was the best way for you to get admitted to vet school. But now we can show you, hey, here would be an exciting career for you.